How old is the name Fiona? It's quite common now, and well known, especially from its use in the Shrek movies. But the question of its age is a bit complicated. One thing we can say for sure is that Fiona was popularized by Fiona Macleod in the late 1800s. Fiona Macleod was a Scottish writer and poet, famous for her Romantic-era novels and poems, and known for her private and reclusive nature.
Who is Fiona Macleod? The critics are much exercised over the question, and few of them appear to have succeeded in raising the veil of incognito behind which the authoress prefers to stay.
A native of the Scottish Highlands, Macleod first received public attention with the novel Farish, coming from a Gaelic quote, Mihida Trial Gutri Farish, meaning it's time for me to go up to the House of Paradise. This novel was published in 1894 and promoted by her cousin, William Sharp, an established editor and writer in the Scottish literary world, which helped propel the book to great success and let it reach other contemporary authors internationally, such as Oscar Wilde, W.B. Yeats, and Douglas Hyde, who called her books the most interesting thing in the new Scoto-Celtic movement.
She is still quite young, and in person is tall and dark, of a pronounced Celtic type, and her friends know her as the daring sailor and confirmed hill lover, rather than as the dreamy romancist of such books as Farish and The Mountain Lovers.
Stylistically, she often wrote in quite a terse manner, short staccato sentences with obvious Gaelic influences, especially in names and occasionally in phrasing. Before the child was born, she said, "He shall be called A of the songs," and so it was. Sweet were his songs. He loved, and he sang, and he died.
Professor Geddes did not hesitate to characterize it as the most marvelous note in Celtic literature since Ossian. Mr. Grant Allen has been pleased to find in Fiona Macleod something Ossianic, and the spirit of the Celtic twilight.
She got a lot of correspondence from other writers, and in some of her responses she discusses her name Fiona, which was uncommon at the time. She wrote in a letter to Ernest Rhys, "It may interest you to know that the name which seems to puzzle so many is, though it does exist as the name Fiona, not only in Ossian, but at the present day, though rarely, the Gaelic diminutive of Fionachal, i.e. Flora. This is the next piece of our puzzle. Fiona claims it's in Ossian, by which she meant the poems of Ossian. In 1762, James Macpherson published Fingal, an English translation of an ancient Gaelic epic he had collected in the Scottish Highlands, reportedly authored by Ossian, son of the titular Fingal and equivalent of the Irish Oisin, the one who went to Tir na nÓg. On its release, Ossian was compared to a Scottish Homer. Macpherson dated the original to somewhere in the 3rd century, based on historical details mentioned in the story. In the epic, Cuchulainn struggles to defend Ireland from the invasion of Swaran, a Viking invader. Fingal, King of Scotland, his sons and his army come to Ireland, and over the course of 4 days of battle, they defeat and capture Swaran, before finally releasing him on the condition that he never return to do harm to Ireland. Fingal was very impactful, gaining a lot of popularity among readers and a broader general interest in Scottish Highland culture. Thomas Jefferson, 3 years before writing the American Declaration of Independence, wrote a letter to a relative of Macpherson, in which he said, "These pieces have been, and will, I think, during my lifetime, continue to be to me the sources of daily pleasures. The tender and sublime emotions of the mind were never before so wrought upon by human hand. I am not ashamed to own that I think this rude bard of the North was the greatest poet that has ever existed. Merely for the pleasure of reading his works, I am desirous of learning the language in which he sung." Napoleon reportedly carried the poems of Ossian, translated to Italian, out to war. Needless to say, a wide reach. But back to Fiona. If we turn to page 13 of the 1762 translation of Fingal, we see the following. "Mourn, ye sons of the song, the death of noble Sithalan. Let the sighs of Fiona rise on the dark heaths of her lovely Arden. They fell, like 2 hinds of the desert, by the hands of the mighty Swaran, when in the midst of thousands he roared like the shrill spirit of a storm, that sits dim on the clouds of Gormal and enjoys the death of the mariner, with a helpful footnote from Macpherson. Sitholin signifies a handsome man, Fiona a fair maid, and Arden pride. This passage describes the death of two of Cuchulain's heroes, Sitholin and Arden, in battle against Swaran. Fiona is only mentioned offhand, seemingly as the lover of Arden. This is the only appearance of the name in the story, as she was not a core character. So Fiona MacLeod was correct. Fiona is in the writings of Ossian, bringing our date back by how far exactly? Well, Macpherson published his translation in 1762, but he had dated it to the 3rd century. That puts our age for the name at around 1800 years, if his dating is correct. But before we can dig into that, there's something I forgot to tell you about Fiona MacLeod. In 1905, Fiona MacLeod's cousin and editor, William Sharp, died, and with him went Fiona. In the days after their death, the papers published the truth, which had been confirmed by Sharp's wife, Elizabeth. Fiona MacLeod was William Sharp. Sharp was born in 1855 in Paisley, in the Scottish Lowlands. He had decent success doing both writing and editing work, with some of his poems receiving praise from writers like Robert Louis Stevenson, George Meredith, and Walt Whitman. In 1893, Fiona MacLeod was born. This name was more than a pseudonym for Sharp. With those who were aware of the secret, he would often refer to Fiona as a separate part of himself. They often discussed how he wrote in a different style under the name, and he repeatedly called her, Fiona, an inspiration to him. Sharp had a habit of writing 2 letters to himself every birthday, one praising his accomplishments, and the other highlighting his failures. After the identity of Fiona developed, he began sending the critical letters as Fiona to William, and the congratulatory letters from William to Fiona. William Sharp was not very adept at secrecy, falling at nearly the first hurdle. Upon finishing Fiona's debut book Farish, he wrote to his friend Catherine Janvier as himself, telling her he found this work by MacLeod interesting and asking her thoughts. He had forgotten, however, a letter he had sent only months before telling Janvier about a new book he was writing, titled Farish. Janvier wrote back to him and asked him to clarify the situation, and he admitted that it was him who wrote it, but asked her and her husband to keep his secret, which they did. Over the years, many of Sharp's friends and colleagues either figured out the story or were told, but nobody ever revealed it publicly. In fact, many of them defended him. When Janvier found out, she wrote back to Sharp inquiring why he chose to write under a woman's name. Sharp explained, "I can write out of my heart in a way I could not do as William Sharp. And indeed, I could not do so if I were the woman Fiona MacLeod is supposed to be, unless veiled in scrupulous anonymity. My truest self, the self who is below all other selves, and my most intimate life and joys and sufferings, thoughts, emotions, and dreams must find expression, yet I cannot save in this hidden way." Though he didn't mention it to Janvier, also noteworthy is the Highland identity of Fiona MacLeod. She was a Gaelic speaker, he was not. Her perceived authenticity lended her credibility, and she was better suited than he was to participate in the burgeoning Celtic revival. This authenticity allowed MacLeod to write in a style that drew on and referenced traditional Gaelic mythology, tropes, and language, in a way that even still was criticized by her peers as being over the top. Grant Allen wrote in response to MacLeod's correspondence, including the following advice. "You are, I take it, a young writer, and so an older hand may give you a hint or two. Don't another time interlard your English with your Gaelic. Even a confirmed Celtomaniac like myself finds it a trifle distracting. Don't say the English and the Gaelic. Forgive this frankness, and remember that success lies in the lap of the Saxon." This same Grant Allen, who was a friend of Sharp, but who had not been let in on the secret, wrote a letter to him soon after, and signed off by saying, "With united kindest regards, and solemn threats of vengeance if you are still perpetrating an elaborate hoax against me, I am ever yours, very sincerely, Grant Allen." There were some journalists and writers who publicized similarities between the writings of Sharp and MacLeod and alleged them to be one and the same. One such article, in 1896, was published by a writer simply signed Mac. The article mentioned how nobody had any concrete evidence of Fiona MacLeod's existence. Nobody had seen her, nobody had any pictures of her, and then says,
"Now William Sharp has declared himself to be Miss Fiona MacLeod's uncle. He has, too, interested himself in Celtic things. Isn't it the second natural inference that he has written the books?"
But in fact, the article goes on to defend Sharp and say that there would be nothing for him to gain by lying about his authorship of the books, and in fact, much to lose. It also asserts that the texts are clearly written by a young woman, and that anyone with a knowledge of literature cannot deny. Part of me wonders whether this article was written by a confidant of Sharp's, given the way it proceeds.
But who is Fiona MacLeod? The question is natural, maybe. But is it any of your business?
Though Elizabeth Sharp references this article in her husband's biography and doesn't give any indication that it was written by a friend. In 1897, in a letter to his wife, he writes, "More and more absolutely, in one sense, are William Sharp and Fiona MacLeod becoming two persons, often married in mind and one nature, but often absolutely distinct." He signed this letter Wilfione, a name Elizabeth coined for the inner personality that lay between William and Fiona. Another article, published in 1899 as an unsigned piece of correspondence in the London Daily Chronicle, confidently makes the claim that Fiona MacLeod is William Sharp, evidencing the fact that much of MacLeod's writing has certain frank and unfeminine modes of expression, in stark contrast to the previous article. The anonymous author also noted how it was strange that Mrs. Sharp did not promote or discuss Fiona MacLeod in her collection Women's Voices, given her obvious familiarity with her work. Literary analysis was provided too, including notes on their overuse or reliance on certain words: myriad, poignant, honey ooze, sunswept, and more. The author adds that
both are addicted to an ever-recurring peculiar employment of the word green.
Sharp struggled with his health for much of his life, having diabetes and issues with his heart. He wrote in a letter to his friend Murray Gilchrist, "To be alive and young and in health is a boon so inestimable that you ought to fall on your knees among your moorland heather and thank the gods. Be brave, strong, self-reliant. Then you live. Your friend, William Sharp." When he passed away on a visit to Sicily, his final words were, "Oh, the beautiful green life again. Ah, all is well." A final occurrence of his peculiar employment of the word green. But regardless of MacLeod's not being who she claimed, the name Fiona was still in Fingal, the ancient epic. So this doesn't really affect our estimated age. We're still looking at around 1800 years old. Right? The Ossian controversy started upon the publishing of Fingal and its less successful follow-up, Temora, and never fully ended. It's a debate about the authenticity of the content, the true age of the work, and the extent to which it was authored by Macpherson himself. Immediately on its release, Fingal raised doubts regarding its origins and authenticity. Even in the very first edition, Macpherson included a dissertation concerning the antiquity, etc. of the poems, on the defense before anyone had even read it. Then, in the 1763 edition, Hugh Blair, who had encouraged Macpherson to publish his translation in the first place, wrote a critical dissertation on the poems of Ossian, in which he defends the authenticity, though in so doing, he provides little real evidence outside of his belief that the contents of the poem seem ancient. The compositions of Ossian are so strongly marked with characters of antiquity that although there were no external proof to support that antiquity, hardly any reader of judgment and taste could hesitate in referring them to a very remote era. Among the first to dispute its authenticity are Charles O'Connor, an Irish antiquarian, and Samuel Johnson, the guy from the 2012 meme picture. O'Connor's has a little more substance to it, mostly highlighting the anachronisms and the language of the poem as clearly not being ancient, certainly not to the extent Macpherson claimed. Notably, there is also a nationalistic element of the argument, in which O'Connor is, correctly, arguing that these are historically Irish stories. Oisin and Fionn and Cuchulainn are Irish, and he doesn't believe that there could be a 1,000-year-old epic found only in Scotland. He does, I think, maybe overstate the case as to the fraudulent intentions of Macpherson, though, and ends his dissertation calling Macpherson not just an impostor, but an incompetent one at that. Let us confess that no gentleman or sharper ever knew less the trade of an able impostor than the most memorable Mr. James Macpherson. Samuel Johnson, an English lexicographer, known for writing one of the most influential dictionaries of English, which was published 173 years before the Oxford English Dictionary, also called out Macpherson's work. His arguments had a similar nationalistic element, in which he argued that Erse, referring to Scottish Gaelic, was not a written language, and that there were in fact no manuscripts at all in the language more than 100 years old. Johnson was entirely incorrect about that, and knew little of the subject matter, but he had a lot of influence within academia, and drew a lot of public scrutiny towards the work of Oisin. Something that many of the dissertations against him raised was the lack of a published version of the Gaelic original. It seems like the most straightforward way to prove the authenticity of his translation, that it was not his own composition, would be to share the original manuscripts, this epic which he had discovered. In 1781, William Shaw wrote a piece skeptical of Macpherson called An Inquiry into the Authenticity of the Poems Ascribed to Oisin. He said, Macpherson says that by passing 6 months in the islands and western coasts of Scotland, together with the help of some manuscripts, he has been enabled to give the world these poems in their present form. This was all the evidence he had to produce for their authenticity, which was enough, were it true, and had he immediately produced the originals, which any gentleman of letters might expect to see, and the public had a right to be put in possession of. These, however, although promised by the editor, have not yet emerged from Mr. Macpherson's strongbox. He also gave the following comically incorrect prediction. The truth is ascertained, and I believe the public will not be favoured with any more translations of Gaelic poems, nor dissertations for or against the authenticity of Oisin. The dissertations, in fact, did not stop there. James Macpherson died in 1796, 32 years after publishing Fingal, and yet still not having released the original Gaelic versions to the public, despite having long promised to do so. The Poems of Oisin in the original Gaelic was published posthumously in 1807, 45 years after Fingal, and once again sparked debate about the veracity of Macpherson's claims. In an 1805 edition of the English version, pointedly named The Poems of Oisin, etc., containing the poetical works of James Macpherson Esquire in prose and rhyme, Malcolm Laing gave background for his belief that the poems were largely Macpherson's own. In his study of Macpherson, he had discovered several poems written by the translator many years prior to publishing Fingal, one called Death, and the second, a heroic poem called The Hunter, and later still, an epic-style heroic poem called The Highlander, which he published in 1758, 3 years before Fingal. This, to Laing at least, established some degree of motivation. Macpherson had an interest in poetry, epic poetry, Scottish poetry, and his previous poems had not been very well respected. He believed that Macpherson wrote Fingal and Temora under the guise of a translation of an ancient work, in order for his own work to be respected. In his dissertation, he posed a challenge. I have repeatedly offered to renounce my objections, to abandon the whole controversy, and, what no disputant ever offered before, to become a sincere convert to the opposite faith, if a single poem of Macpherson's Oisin could be pointed out in an Erse manuscript above a century old. Though he disputed the authenticity of Oisin as an ancient or translated text, Laing was not unappreciative of the content itself. He wrote, "I first read the poems in my early youth with an ardent credulity that remained unshaken for many years of my life, and with a pleasure to which even the triumphant satisfaction of detecting the imposture is comparatively nothing. The enthusiasm with which I read and studied the poems enabled me afterwards, when my suspicions were once awakened, to trace and expose the deception with greater success. Yet, notwithstanding the severity of minute criticism, I can still peruse them as a wild and wonderful assemblage of imitation with which the fancy is often pleased and gratified, even when the judgment condemns them most." Not everyone was so dismissive of Macpherson's claims, though. In the 1807 release of the original, John Sinclair included a credulous dissertation with the aim that the original Gaelic would finally lay people's skepticism to rest. In the late 1800s, Hector Maclean wrote that the Gaelic being released definitively proved the poem's invalidity based on the quality of the language. In many lines, the words only are Gaelic. The structure has nothing to do with the language. The sentences may be English, or Latin, or Greek, may in fact be specimens of a new universal language, but they are not Gaelic. Bad grammar and violated idiom abound everywhere. A little bit earlier, in 1870, Archibald Clerk had published a literal English translation of the 1807 Gaelic version, and vehemently believed that the Gaelic was the original, saying, "On this particular point of the Gaelic being the original, I feel such a thorough conviction as constrains me to speak emphatically." Unfortunately, Clerk may be the most gullible man alive. What evidence does he provide? Well, he claims that the Gaelic version is just better than Macpherson's translation. One thing is beyond all doubt or dispute to any rational man who understands both the Gaelic and the English languages. That is, that the Gaelic is the original and the English the translation. There is a living freshness, a richness, a minuteness of colouring and detail in the similes of the Gaelic, of which not a trace is to be found in the indefinite, hazy generalities of Macpherson's translation. You may remember that previous critics of Macpherson have mentioned issues with the quality of the Gaelic. What then does this translator have to say about it? Clerk acknowledges these strange aspects in the syntax and grammar of the poems, saying, "There is a remarkable absence of secondary or subsidiary words, of pronouns, prepositions, and conjunctions." He notes a lack of inflection as well, but, in the mental leap of a lifetime, claims that this in fact shows the poem is so old that it predates those kinds of inflection in the language. Over time, consensus has developed a bit. While individual authors wrote dissertations claiming he was a faithful translator or a malicious huckster, in 1805, Henry Mackenzie headed the Report of the Committee of the Highland Society, a lengthy report with a copious appendix, which paints a more nuanced picture. This nuanced picture is supported by some of the more recent writing on the topic, such as that by Derek Thompson. What Derek and Mackenzie both agree on is that Macpherson did not create the works of Ossian, particularly Fingal, whole cloth. The characters and many sequences and stories featured were well established in the Scottish and Irish oral tradition and in manuscripts. However, it seems equally clear to both of them that there is no concrete evidence of that specific epic ever existing prior to him. It is at best a speculative reconstruction of what could have been, and a loose one at that. The stories were not combined in the way that they may have been historically. For example, Cuchulainn and Fionn and Oisin exist in totally different periods in the historical mythology, the Ulster cycle and the Fenian cycle respectively. And the names were often changed at will or to make stories fit together better, with one scholar saying, "One cannot mention all the numberless personal names invented deliberately by Macpherson." This gives us a clue as to what may have happened with the name Fiona. If we look at the 1805 Gaelic originals and turn to the page we discussed earlier, we see something strange. Bí bronach a híl nan dan, mu hihalin nan garif shia, toksa evich, duch kban, mu har ardan nan kolak fiar. We see that in the Gaelic passage, there is nothing resembling Fiona. Instead, it is Evit, a name likely derived from Ever, the wife of Cuchulainn. If we were to believe that these original manuscripts were truly unedited, perfect copies of thousand-year-old epic poetry, even then, the trail ends here. Fiona would not be older than Macpherson's translation. And what of the explanation given by William Sharp, that Fiona was a diminutive of the name Fionnagal? Well, we get more insight into his perspective in the letter he wrote to Mrs. Janvier about his name. Fiona, is very rare now. Most Highlanders would tell you it was extinct, even as the diminutive of Fionnagal. But it is not. It is an old Celtic name, meaning a fair maid. Clearly, his source is the footnote by Macpherson that we saw earlier. The Fionnagal explanation holds little water. That name is usually spelt with two N's, and modern Gaelic doesn't form diminutives just by chopping the ends off of words, nor does the start of Fionnagal sound at all like today's Fiona. So if we believe that Fiona was one of the many names created solely by the pen of Macpherson, there are some things we would need to confirm. Namely, that we don't see any examples of it prior to his 1761 publication of Fingal. When I was in the process of researching this video, I found an excellent essay by Harry Josephine Giles on Substack. She had the same question as me about Fiona and had fallen down the rabbit hole as well, link in the description. In her essay, Giles checked digitized Scottish records, not just before Macpherson, but all the way up to the publishing of Fiona MacLeod's work. She only found 11 people named Fiona. Of these people, when looking at the handwriting in the scanned records, it's very hard to confirm any of them as Fiona, especially given the historical popularity of Flora compared to the modern popularity of Fiona. It's easy to see how people could get it wrong during digitization. Inspired, I did a similar check of Irish church records, which go back further than available census records, and tried to find the name Fiona. And aside from one mysterious burial record reporting the death of one Fiona McMeckins in 1722, the name doesn't appear until 1903, where we see the birth of several Fionas, 10 years after the publishing of Fadhis. The next time a Fiona dies is in 1944, when Fiona Harkin died in Rathdown. I assumed Fiona McMeckins was probably an error in digitization. There's no photograph or scan of the 1722 record, so I was unable to verify it, and I moved on. But as I was writing the video, it nagged at me. If Fiona McMeckins really existed, then it would throw the whole video into question. Maybe it was a real but obscure name, plucked out by Macpherson for a minor role in his story. So I went to the representative church body library, which stores historical registers for Church of Ireland parishes. The record for Fiona McMeckins on the website states that she was buried on the 1st of March 1722, in the parish of St. Nicholas Without in Dublin, a church formerly based in the north transept of St. Patrick's Cathedral. I checked the parish records in the library, and sure enough, there was no Fiona McMeckins listed as being buried in 1722. This gave me some peace of mind, but I was still confused where the digitized record came from. There was still a risk I'd missed something. Eventually, after more digging, I decided to check the register for the nearby parish of St. Nicholas Within. And here I found my smoking gun. On the Irish genealogy website, there is another record in that parish which says Meccan, buried March 1st, 1722. This seemed like it could be what I was looking for. And luckily, this record has a scanned version, though not of the original manuscript. In this we see on March 1st that an old woman from Mr. Meckins was buried. It's unclear who this woman was, but sometimes people would be recorded in these records solely based on their relation to someone else, especially if they were poor or a child. Where then did the name Fiona get given to this unnamed woman? Well, if you look at the manuscript held by the RCB library, we see the same line written out in cursive. From Mr. Meckins has been misread as Fiona McMeckins. And just like that, Fiona McMeckins was no more. Any appearances of the name Fiona in texts before 1761 that I've found online are similar transcription or character recognition errors. Usually of the name Flora, or the word from, or the name Fionn. Giles also links to a post by Sharon L. Crossa. There's a lot of good information on the website regarding names and their history, but Crossa says of Fiona, the modern name spelled Fiona, or any name pronounced Fiona, cannot be documented or even reasonably supposed to have existed in the Middle Ages. Crossa references O'Curain and Maguire's 1981 book Irish Names, which lists the name Fiona, but clarifies that it is not the name Fiona which was invented by William Sharp. Though of course, I think it's now clear that Sharp did not invent the name himself, rather borrowing it from Macpherson. Regarding the name Fiona, the book says that it comes from Fine, meaning vine, which was the name of an abbess in Kildare in the early 9th century. But they make no argument to connect the two other than similarity. Fine is still a word in modern Irish, and I've seen little evidence that Fiona was ever a common name before the popularity of Fiona. Hank's Dictionary of Personal Names from 2006 corroborates that Macpherson was the inventor of the name Fiona. Interestingly, there's a chance that William Sharp knew about this. He himself was an editor of an 1896 edition of the Poems of Ossian. This is likely where he found the name Fiona, but he has a fairly modern understanding about Macpherson's role in the story. In the introduction he writes, Macpherson's Ossian is not a translation either of ancient or of medieval legendary sagas. He may have also felt some kinship with Macpherson when he started writing under the name Fiona MacLeod, and comparisons sometimes occurred within the press as well. The article I talked about by Mac comes out swinging with this comparison.
Highland Celts in Glasgow are, I hear, hot on the scent of what they believe to be a female James Macpherson. This, of course, is Miss Fiona MacLeod.
But if he knew the name was invented by Macpherson, he never acknowledged it in writing. After being created by Macpherson, the name lay dormant for many years, being plucked out of obscurity once to name a genus of sea slug, and later to be a Scottish writer's pseudonym. Prior to MacLeod, I could find no characters or people referred to by the name other than Macpherson's Fiona. After Fiona MacLeod's writing spread, however, the name began to spring up in other places. As early as 1896, 2 years after MacLeod's first book, there are reports in newspapers of a song called Fiona being performed, though I haven't managed to find the lyrics of this song. In 1897, the Scottish writer Annie Swan gave the name to one of her characters in a book called The Ne'er-Do-Well. In 1898, Arthur and Emily Jenkinson published a romance novel called Fiona MacIver. In 1899, there was a story for kids written by Ella Shanke in the Aberdeen Press and Journal called Fiona the Feather Gatherer. In the early years of the 1900s, we start seeing children named Fiona, and it's easy to see how the name spread from there. So there you have it. Fiona is 265 years old. It is slightly older than the United States of America, and a bit younger than fire extinguishers and the mercury thermometer. So what does this mean? The name Fiona isn't authentic? Isn't truly Scottish? No, I wouldn't say that. And in fact, I think it's dangerous to get overly involved in the concept of purity and authenticity in these kind of discussions. The name Deirdre is clearly older than Fiona. Deirdre is the centre of a tragic love triangle within the Ulster cycle of Irish mythology, and we have evidence of that story dated to at least the 12th century. However, this name, if it was ever commonly used, clearly died out between then and modern times, being revived in the 20th century, popularised by the Gaelic Revival and the publishing of English language works, like Deirdre and the Sons of Usna by Fiona MacLeod, Deirdre by W.B. Yeats, and Deirdre of the Sorrows by J.M. Synge. This is evidenced by the fact that even in Irish, the name often tends to be pronounced Deirdre rather than Deirdre, which is how the name would be pronounced based on Irish spelling rules. There's also nobody named Deirdre in the historical annals. Is Deirdre authentic? Táin Bó Cúailnge, or the Cattle Raid of Cooley, is the most well-known epic in Irish mythology. It features Cuchulainn defending Ulster from the invasion of Queen Maeve. I say mythology, but it's important to remember that all of the stories that make up what we call Irish mythology come to us from manuscripts written by Christian monks in Ireland, meaning that the lines between mythology and literature can be blurred. The oldest version of this story is found in Laurnaheere and the Yellow Book of Lecan. These books are from the 12th and 14th century respectively, but based on the language in this story, scholars have dated at least parts of it to the 8th century. Laurnaheere, the older book of the two, contains many references by the scribe to other versions of the text, making it evident that this version was a compilation, perhaps a reconstruction. Many authors have noted repetition and nonsensical placement of certain episodes in this older recension of the story, which can make it seem like an older attempt at reconstruction, with the later version, in the Book of Leinster, being a more polished attempt to bring everything in order. Is Táin Bó Cúailnge authentic? Tuiríocht Diarmid agus Gráine, or The Pursuit of Diarmid and Gráine, is a well-known story in Irish mythology involving Gráine, who is engaged to Fionn, eloping with one of his warriors, Diarmid, instead. The oldest written version of this story is from 1651, written by a monk named Dáví ó Dúchanainn, only about 100 years before Macpherson's Fingal. It seems that some version of this story existed since at least the 14th century, since we have an offhand reference in a poem from 1398, and while we know he was influenced by existing works and presumably oral tradition, it's really unclear to what extent the composition we now have was his own. Is this story authentic? Sometimes I see people complain, upon seeing retellings of myths, that the retelling was wrong, that it got details incorrect about certain characters or stories. And I sympathize with this experience, but at the same time, we have to remember that these stories are fictional, and that though we may identify some early written version as canonical, the monks writing these manuscripts were not doing so in an act of neutral preservation. The monks who wrote these had motives which are not always clear to the readers of today. They were writing from a Christian perspective, which influenced how they portrayed certain characters. They would have been influenced by existing stories and often copied parts of other manuscripts or reused turns of phrase. Along with any motivation they may have had to preserve text, they also had a motivation to make the text good, whatever that meant to them. Mark Williams, a professor of global medieval literature at Oxford, wrote, "It is worth pausing here to stress just how deeply Christianity is woven into all early Irish myth, however that is defined. This material is best understood as an account of the heroic pre-Christian past as imagined by the clerical intelligentsia of early Christian Ireland. They had three purposes: to entertain their powerful patrons, to reinforce their patrons' claims to power by telling stories about their supposed forebears, and to give moral instruction to a warrior class who, while Christian, did not always live up to Christian values." A particular example of this conflict of interests is the mortalizing of pre-Christian gods. Because all of our text from the time comes from these Christian writings, we know very little about pre-Christian deities in Ireland. But for the figures who we do believe to have been deities, like Lugh, they reappear in these Christian texts, often still with some amount of power, but not expressly as gods. This makes sense, of course. Christian monks wouldn't have portrayed any god other than their own. But this process of turning pagan gods into literary figures is an example of how the people writing these stories aren't necessarily focused on authenticity. Even if the monks wrote down these folk stories unaltered, straight from the mouth of their local seanchaí, rather than relying on existing manuscripts as they seem to have here, folklore is dynamic and ever-changing. The stories that are told are not true, nor is their truth really a relevant question. They tell us something about the culture they existed in, the people who told the stories, and those who listened. As folklorists know, authenticity is an evanescent value where creative uses of folklore are concerned. Yet the residue of moral certainty clings to claims of authenticity in the study of culture and has continued to guide historians and arbiters of cultural value. Oisín ar Hyd na nÓg, or Oisín in the Land of the Young, is maybe the most well-known and referenced story in Irish mythology today, and probably the only story most people could name about Oisín. This story, was written in 1750 by a poet named Micheál Cuimhin, right around the time of Macpherson's poems of Ossian being shared around by the Scottish men of letters. This poem of Ossian was being shared around the west of Ireland in manuscript copies being read out by local storytellers. Rather than being rejected as a fake or inauthentic story, it was accepted and canonized into the cultural understanding of the mythology. Is this story authentic? Macpherson, in his efforts to create or reconstruct an Ossianic epic, did in fact collect much native and traditional material in this vein, helping to preserve many manuscripts and stories. And he's cited by some as the reason why further work was done into collecting more in the following years. I understand the appeal of things which are verifiably ancient. It's exciting to find a story written hundreds or thousands of years ago which we can still relate to today. But sometimes we equate antiquity to authenticity, and just because someone wrote a story earlier doesn't mean it has any more claim to culture. It just means it's indicative of a culture of a different time. The name Fiona is not old, and it doesn't come from the Gaelic language. That much is factual. But from a cultural perspective, it is definitely Scottish. Created by Macpherson, who was raised by Gaelic speakers in the Highlands, popularised by Sharp, who was raised without Gaelic in the Lowlands, and spreading first in Scotland, and then throughout the English-speaking world and beyond, the name can't be separated from its Scottish history, however short that history might be. Folklore develops as it's told. The people telling it shape the stories and create the canon. Giles ended her essay with an anecdote shared by Mrs. Janvier in an article called Fiona MacLeod and her creator, William Sharp. I think it's fitting to include it here too. One day, in quest of some Fiona lore, Mr. Sharp and I rode to a point of rocks jutting out in the Clyde. Ruath Nanyon, he called it. As we rounded the point, we saw lying at anchor a fishing boat painted white. And as we neared her, I made out what looked like Fiona lettered on her bow. I did not think this possible, and concluded it must be Flora. But on closer view, we saw plainly the unusual name, Fiona. And then, as we came beside the supposedly empty boat, we were a little startled by the slow uprising above the rail of a man. He was a pleasant-faced fisher who readily answered all our questions. Mr. Sharp said to him, "That's a pretty name of your boat. For sure it's a real name?" The man answered in a very soft, agreeable voice, "Oh yes, for sure it's a real name." "And will it be the name of someone you know?" "Aye, I've heard that the daughter of Mr. McLean, the minister out Iona Way, is called Fiona." "Ah then, it will be after her." No, for sure, it wasn't after her." "Then it will be after your wife or sweetheart." "Ah no, it will only be after a writing lady, a great Highland lady." "Oh, a writing lady, who will that be?" "Well, she will be called Miss Fiona MacLeod."